Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of our webinars, all about choosing books for the classroom. And as usual, I'm accompanied today by members of our review panel, and they're real experts when it comes to thinking about graphic novels. I can't wait to have a conversation with them, and I'm sure you can't wait to meet them. So let's have a look and see who's with me today. Through the square window, it looks just like play school, doesn't it? Through the square window, we have got Richard Charlesworth, Rich Charlesworth. So I don't think you've done one of these before, Rich.
No, I've been lucky to know you for many years, but haven't done one of these before. So this will be fun and exciting. I know it'll be fantastic.
Fantastic. Can't wait to hear more about your choices. Roy Moss, you'll know, who's our resident blogger. And Ben Harris, you'll know, because he has been a stalwart on an audience with, but also managing and running the book club with me when I'm organised enough to set it up. Anyway, Ben is absolutely fantastic. And so really welcome to all three of you. Before we get on to see something about your individual choices, I'm interested to know when the interest and the passion for graphic novels or comics, let's call them both, people like Paul Gravett insist on us calling them comics, when your passion started. Maybe I'll come to you. Ben, I think you might be the oldest. So I'm coming to you because you almost go, you not quite, but you almost go back as far as me.
Well, when I was growing up, it was comics, and I used to get, them all the time. Not the Beano or the Dandy, but there were various sort of short-lived sort of comic books that we used to get from the newsagents and things. But my brother and I used to do that, and I think it also, which I'll come back to with my choices as well, is that I think growing up in the 80s, a lot of it was to do with the beginnings of computer gaming as well, and I think there's a crossover with the graphic novel format and computer games of that period. So I think there was a little bit of that, and I think there were some comics that we used to get, my brother and I, about which linked with new comic games that were out and films that were out and things. So very visual sort of background.
I'm just going to say, when you're not talking, I think because we're getting a tiny little bit of feedback, if you turn the mics off, except when it's your turn to talk, that will help the sound. So, Ben, I wondered whether you also read the kind of syndicated comic strips in newspapers, because for me, one of my early memories was always going to the station to meet my dad coming home from work, and he'd always have the newspaper. It would have been what would it have been? The Standard, I suppose, was the London newspaper. And that's the first thing we'd do when he got home would be to look at the syndicated comic strips. So obviously there's Peanuts, but there was Andy Capp, the Wizard of Id. The Wizard of Id was very weird, I seem to remember. Did you have that as well?
Not so much the comic strips. I do remember that the Sunday Times used to do, or they were the first ones, I think, to sort of tap into the children's market. And they used to do something called the Fun Day Times, and it was a sort of 8-page comic newspaper type thing that was tucked inside, and there were strips with that as well. So I do remember it being with newspapers. I didn't used to read so much the strips in the adult bit. Maybe I thought that was sort of for the grown-ups. I had my own Fun Day time, so being the kid.
Today I might understand the Wizard of Id, but as a 6-year-old, I just thought it was all very bewildering. Roy, what about you?
Yeah, a couple of things. You think bringing up the Peanuts comic strip just then made me remember I would scour school fates bookstools for the Peanuts books that they collected comic strips in the little paperbacks. And I remember, having about 5 of those for sort of like 20p each, which was, just a suddenly memory just come back. It's lovely. And then, my parents would take me to the library as well every couple of weeks, and I would get the Asterix books. I would work my way through those. Yeah, and then I came to like other graphic novels a lot later, sort of in my late 20s, 30s. So I suppose they've always been there in a way. Yeah, definitely.
What was interesting for me, it's interesting, I've got 3 men and there's me. It's not an entirely male-dominated world by any stretch of the imagination. But certainly when I was growing up, there was a sort of expectation that my brother would like Marvel and I would like Bunty. But I loved Marvel, so I would always go and steal the Marvel comics from under his bed. I was totally in love as well with Spider-Man, and can remember, I mean, I love the villains in particular, and there was one villain, Princess Python, who just stuck in my head, and apparently she only ever appeared in 2 episodes, but I just remembered her so much from that time. And then people would buy my brother the Giles albums, so, but not me, and yet I really loved them. So thank goodness it's not so male dominated these days. Rich, you've probably, I know you actually go to, you've scoured the comic stores for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one for me. It still taps into a love of the library and having access to a library. And I think part of it as well, in terms of when I was growing up, I went through a lot of Tintin and Asterix. And I think there's definitely scope for discussion about representation, in terms of I was very privileged enough to kind of have a character that I could relate to quite easily. Some people have said I've styled my hair on Tintin ever since, but that's not true. But I think it taps into 2 things for me: that love of and access to them. And I think part of it is the series as well, in the fact that you get used to the characters, you get used to sort of, I suppose, arcs within stories. But then I think with graphic novels, what's interesting is that you've got them across. If they're part of a series, you go on these journeys with them. So I think it appealed to my younger self. And as Roy was saying, sort of I kind of fell out of love of reading sort of after secondary school, and then picked it back up when I was doing my teaching degree through picture books. So I think it was through that visual form, and I was just so happy to see that it's definitely gone into not necessarily a renaissance, but definitely emerged as a much more, there's so much depth to them. And I think I started to notice that as a younger reader with like the Latin names within Asterix and Obelix. And I think some of it went over my child brain, but returning to it as an adult, you get to see sort of a different angle, a different kind of depth to them, which was really interesting for me.
I was talking to one of the graphic novels that I'm going to share later. I was talking to Sylvie Kantorowicz about Asterix, and obviously she's a French speaker. She lives in Canada, but she's French. And she told me that she thought that the English translation of Asterix is so much better than reading it in the French, so really superbly translated text. Anyway, we're going to come back to some other issues as we start talking through the books, but I'm going to ask you and Roy to go into the green room while I talk to Ben for a little while. So let's have a chat. Hi, Ben, just you and I now in the room. So you've kind of chosen a few books that are aimed at younger readers. And actually, this is a new movement, isn't it? I would say.
Yeah, I think that it's really important for younger children to learn about how to read graphic novels as well through comics, because one of the things that I hear quite a lot from grown-ups when I'm sort of, talking about graphic novels and why they're so good in the classroom is that some of them say, "Oh, I really struggle with reading comic books or graphic novels. I don't know, I can't read them in that sort of way." And I've never really had a problem with that. I've never experienced the same. But I think it's because I started young. And I think that, I'm sure all of us are going to be talking about how valid the comic book or the graphic novel is for not only for reading for pleasure, but general reading, depth of reading skills. There's an awful lot that you're getting from a graphic novel. And I think that young children don't have as many of the inverted commas great, graphic novel writers writing for them. And yet there has been, I think, like you say, Nikki, there's been a lot of um, new graphic novels that are being published by really good writers who and illustrators. So yeah, there's I've put a few that are maybe less seen as graphic novels as well, and yet there are things in them that actually sort of touch on the graphic novel reading style. Yeah.
Rich mentioned picture books and how they'd drawn him back into a love of reading. And actually, many picture book makers were inspired by comics. You only have to look at Minnie Gray. I know that you're very familiar with her work, and you can see that influence. And she's by no means the only one where you see the influence of that comic reading.
No, and I think people like Posy Simmons as well. Shirley Hughes. There's a couple of comic strips. I remember one of my first memories, actually going back to that memory thing, is a book that I got, which was a sort of compilation of lots of different people's short stories. And Shirley Hughes's contribution was a bizarre sort of thing that went along the bottom of the page, and it was a queue of people. And they were all queuing for something, and nobody knows what the queue is for until you you turn the page eventually, and there's this creature that's eating all the people at the front of the queue, and the people have finally realized what they're queuing towards, and they're all trying to get away at the end. There's quite a lot of irony in that, which you wouldn't necessarily associate so much with Shirley Hughes, but
Although her wordless book Up and Away is
yes,
very
yeah,
much a comic book influence, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
So, Ben, I'm going to ask you if you would talk about a couple of your books to begin with. Super Happy Magic Forest and Hilda and the Troll. And I'm just going to hand over to you to talk about them.
Okay. So, Super Happy Magic Forest is a picture book by Matty Long. This was his first book, and he's written, I think, 3 or 4 sequels in the picture book format, and he's also developed them into young chapter books as well, sort of for the 6 to 8 market. Super Happy Magic Forest, though, being the first one, and those of you who know where I've talked before, I'm with year 6 children, and this is the sort of book that when you look at what they're reading in the pictures, you can see that there are certain things that are in the graphic novel format. So very straight away, you've got the comic strip bubbles for speech, and but more than that, you've got a story that is going along in the pictures. So there is a story with the text. I don't know if you can see it very well. Yes, there we go. So you've got a little story, as in a traditional picture book format, with the text at the top there of what's going on in the main story. But Matty's pictures are so detailed that working with year 6s, they are picking up on, quite naturally, are picking up on those little stories that are within the picture as well. So there are things going on here that relate to other pages which are separate to the main narrative. And I think this is something that is really important about graphic novel reading, is that there is reading of the pictures that really does necessitate a good focus and a good sort of understanding on the part of the reader. So something like Super Happy Magic Forest, I have to say I initially picked it up thinking it was a picture book, but it has this really interesting blend of the picture book and graphic novel. just like with graphic novels as well, and with all the sequels, you've got these favorite characters. My personal favorite is Trevor, the toadstool here. Although the unicorn Blossom is rather amazing as well in a lot of the stories. So yeah, there's lots of great characters there, and in the sequels, they all sort of either come to the fore or move to the back, just like in lots of traditional graphic novel series as well. I'm not sure if Nikki's going to come back to me. Yes, there she is.
Hi, Ben. I was just going to ask you to go straight into Hilda and the Troll.
Oh, sorry, and Hilda as well.
Yes, you don't need any.
I'll go on to Hilda. So Hilda and the Troll by Luke Pearson is another one where we've got this series of books. I'm hoping there's going to be some more coming out. It seemed to have stopped. They seem to have stopped for a little while, but it might be maybe Luke Pearson, the author, is busy with Netflix, because this was turned into a Netflix series. My copy has got the little sticker, and I think for younger readers as well, the visual element of Hilda and the Troll, and seeing it as a cartoon version on the TV, helps them to make those connections between the moving images that are on the screen and the still images that are in the book. However, with a graphic novel, and this is much more traditionally graphic novel, this isn't picture book. With a graphic novel, you have to imagine that movement that you would see on the screen. And I wonder if this is something that, like, where I've spoken to adults who say they can't quite get into graphic novels, is that the speed at which you read. I read graphic novels very fast, and a lot of the children read them very fast. As a mature reader, I think I probably should read a bit slower, but I think I definitely do read them much more as films, or, as I'll be talking about a little bit later with Press Start, as gaming style platform games. So Hilda is all about this girl called Hilda, and she lives up in the mountains with a lot of strange creatures that are inspired, I think, by Scandinavian mythology. So there are trolls, but there are also strange giants. There are floating these creatures here that float around in the sky. So there's a whole mythology that's been created there. And again, it's the idea of a series which builds the children's confidence to read something like this, because you're going from book to book and having the same friendly characters that go with you. The stories, the adventures are very gentle. There's enough sort of danger and excitement for the children as well, for the younger ones. But this is a great one for the sort of 7 to 9-year-old age. Although, again, as a year 6 teacher, my class have loved reading these and watching the cartoon as well.
Now we get to talk about Press Start, which you've already mentioned.
Yes.
So this is this has a gaming aesthetic to us. They've been around in the States for quite a long time, actually, even though Thomas Flintham is, a UK-based author illustrator. But now they've been bought in, and you're going to tell us about them.
Yeah, so Press Start, I only got to know them very recently, and I haven't read all of them. But the premise is that there is it is based on computer games, and if you look, I think there's a lot of nostalgia here for me, because if you look at the font, it's very pixelated. It reminds me just of my Spectrum 48K, which I grew up with, and there's something about, I chose these ones because there is something about gaming and graphic novels that I've touched on with Hilda and the visual element of the cartoons, but with something like Press Start, there is a very overt gaming style. These also are a little bit like Super Happy Magic Forest, in that there's predominantly pictures with a story that's going on. They're very bold. There we go. That's great. Oh, thank you, Nikki, for putting some examples up there. So you can see that there's the story going along there. But you've also got the speech bubbles. You've got, this is a great example, actually, this page, Nikki. So you've got on the left, you've got this broken sort of cutting across. So that, again, it's that sort of filmic visualized style. And when you see Sunny, which is the Sunny the bunny, who is there, he is in that very sort of pixelated style. So he is the hero there, and having to solve problems just as you would in a sort of traditional platform game, as he goes through the adventure.
Yeah. I can't take any credit for the choice of slide. It was one that Thomas himself picked to demonstrate his art. And if anybody's watching this video, they might also like to watch one going up at the same time, which is myself talking to Thomas Flintham and Jerry Craft and Sylvie Kantorowicz. And interestingly, Ben, Thomas, I thought it was interesting anyway. He said the pixelated art was much more difficult to achieve that effect than the art on the left-hand side.
Yeah,
So much preciseness.
I think he's actually, what he's doing there as well. I mean, I don't know, and it'd be really interesting to hear what he's got to talk about. Is, although it's very simple, I think it has got a very nostalgic sort of style. It is very much of that, a very early computer gaming platform style stuff. Manic Miner was the game that I used to love. It used to play Hall of the Mountain King. I mean, going back to Hilda and the Troll there, but it had Hall of the Mountain King done in this really really weird noise. But it's that sort of very basic style that he's done there really brilliantly. So, you know, that's really interesting to hear that the easiest, the simpler style is the thing that's taken him the most time.
It was difficult.
Yeah.
And something else that you said that I thought was really interesting there, I felt with all three of the graphic artists that I talked to, this is a phrase you'll remember from Sita Brahmachari talking to us in an audience with. I felt all of them were writing back into their own childhoods with these books. So just show you.
That's with me. I think with these graphic novels, like I say, I've never, as an adult, I mean, I didn't read comics after I was sort of maybe, I don't know, 13, something like that, and then coming back to graphic novels when I started teaching about 13 years after that. So, you know, in my early mid-20s, early 30s. And I think that it's something that I just grew up. It was part of my reading diet. And I think I just learned to read in a particular way for comics. I learned to read in a particular way for novels. And it's, definitely going back into my childhood. Yeah.
And just have a quick look at this page here, because this is like the splash page that you get, say, in a Marvel comic, where there's so much going on around the page. A good contrast. Again, Thomas picked this one up for us to look at.
And you can see there what I'm getting at with the Super Happy Magic Forest. I mean, those spreads which have got lots and lots of things going on, like, you know, this one with the ice creatures and things. But this one here, you know, the stylized drawing is just like that sort of, you know, the loading page that you might have got when the Spectrum took about 4.5 hours to load up one game. And yeah, going into it's
what
like,
do you notice?
nostalgia.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry. Sometimes there's this lag, isn't there, between us? What do you think about the color palette here?
Well, it's the for me, what I see there is the Spectrum, and it had I remember the colors across the top of the Spectrum on the rubber keys. One was red, two was something else. I remember cyan, and you know the mountains there are cyan, yellow, magenta was the pink there. And so that is very much that color, and it's just a complete block of those colors on black, obviously, and white. But the characters down the bottom here, they're sort of in different shades and things, but the big impact of that page is the 9 or 10 colors that were associated with the number keys on the 48K spectrum. So
10 out of 10, because that's exactly what he was doing. The
Oh,
cyan,
wow.
magenta, yellow, and black.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there you
there we
are.
go.
Passed the quiz.
Good old,
And
good old Spectrum 48K. They should bring them back.
I'm coming back to you on your own just to tell us a little bit about narwhal and jelly.
Ah, yes, and Narwhal and Jelly, which I think is the is another book that children, particularly the younger ones that I've known who've come to look at my graphic novel collection in the classroom have really enjoyed. And this is about Narwhal, who is a little bit sort of outgoing and crazy, and his more reserved and thoughtful pal Jelly, the jellyfish. And I really find with this one I think is the most sort of I don't know, heartfelt and heartwarming stories. That this on the back, there's a very clear sort of indicator of the style, which looks very much more like the traditional newspaper type cartoons that Nikki was talking about earlier. And inside, the spreads are much more simple than some of the things we've been looking at, and yet it's still a graphic novel. You've got these lines to show who is speaking, and the different sizes of fonts, and they have lots of little adventures. I think there's 6 in the series now, although I could be wrong. There was a Christmas special one, and I haven't read the 6th one, but we've got Narwhal, Peanut Butter and Jelly, and Narwhal's otter friend, who is actually an otter.
So I'm just going to segue from what you were talking about there into Bumble and Snug. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. If anybody wants to listen to Mark Bradley, I did make a podcast with him last year when the first book came out, might be even 2 years ago now. But we're just about to get the 3rd Bumble and Snug coming out very, very soon. And the reason that I put this up, and it links so nicely in a way to Narwhal and Jelly, is because as I was reading more of these younger graphic novels, I realised how many of them were about comedy duos, contrasting characters. And Roy and I had a little conversation about this, and he's written a superb blog, which is also going to go live at exactly the same time that our video comes out. So let's just have a look at a couple of spreads inside. And Roy, tell us a little bit, set the scene for us about some of these comedy duos.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. And the more I researched it, the more sort of links I discovered about the past and different comedy duo acts there have been on TV. And it was really interesting. And, a lot of, the usual trope is the straight man and the funny man. But Charlie Higson wrote an article in the TLS that it's more appropriate to say it's more order and chaos. So one character is always trying to make sense of the world, and the other one is trying to tear it all apart. And I think Bumble and Snug is a good example of that, I think. You've got Snug, who is quite reserved, enjoys the library, and you've got Bumble, who is, I think it says in the first one, it's 50% enthusiasm, 50% energy, and 100% excitement. And I think that just sums it up brilliantly. So yeah,
I really know the Investigators series.
Yes,
because they don't have the contrast in the same, the visual contrast that these characters have. Although there are differences between them. Do they fit into the same idea, Roy?
Well, not quite, no. So that's more of like you have an intelligent one and a foolish one. That's kind of more that setup. and yeah, so it's slightly different. It's in some sitcoms you have someone with a superiority complex, but I think it's not very helpful to have that in a graphic novel for children, because it's a bit too unbalanced, or it's a bit unfair. But the fool and the more intelligent one, I think, is more in investigators, definitely. Yeah.
Interesting. Ben, is that something that you've thought about when you've seen these kind of younger graphic novels? Have you noticed any other duos that appear?
You've put me on the spot here. There is one. Well, it's not a duo, but I know there's one. There's a series, I think, called PB&J, which is a P, a B, and a J bird. But it's the three of them. But what that is a new sort of thing that I've seen there with those. That's really interesting to see the two sort of opposites, the yin and yang sort of,
And it's really interesting when it comes to sort of slapstick as well. When you get the slapstick ones, sort of like the Jamie Smart Bunny versus Monkey ones. And when I was researching, slapstick goes right back to Greek comedy. And the closest to Greek comedy there was on sitcom was things like Bottom and Rick Mail and Aid Edmondson. And it's interesting that graphic novels can have a direct link to ancient Greece, which is fantastic. I think this is great.
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to see. We're going to go straight to you now, Roy, but I'm going to bring Ben back in later. And I'm sure some of these other connections that we can, if we choose to, pick up in the classroom, we can pick up. We don't have to, but it's interesting to note them because then, we incidentally bring these things into conversations with children. So you've led us into some extremely interesting places there, as always, Ben. So hopefully you can enjoy the green room while I talk to
Thank
Roy.
you.
Hi, Roy.
Hello.
So we've talked a little bit there about this forthcoming blog. Can't wait to read all of it. And the same way that I asked Ben if he'd talk about a couple of the books, on his own, before us coming together and discussing them, I wonder whether you could do that for This Was Our Pact and Global.
Yes. So This Was Our Pact. It's one of those books that you when you finish reading it, you just wish you could read it again for the first time. It was one of those, and it's written by a guy called Ryan Andrews. And I suppose the simple premise is that the best I can describe it is that it's sort of a mix between the 80s films like Goonies and other 80s movies like that, and Spirited Away, the Hayao Miyazaki film. So 5 friends head off on a journey to find out where some paper lanterns from an autumn equinox festival go after they head off down the river. And the friends are determined to go farther than anyone else's before. And they have a pact that no one goes home and no one turns back. However, soon 3 of the boys do head back, and there's only 2 left. And what I enjoy about this, like Spirited Away, is the blend of reality and the strangeness and of like fantasy. And it starts on this page where they reach a bridge, and it's the threshold. Like many fantasy stories, it connects sort of like the real world to the fantasy world. It's their journey, and there's this great bit of dramatic irony where the reader knows that they're in a strange fantasy world, but the characters don't, and they're on this bridge, and there's this very strange sort of being behind them, like a giant, which is wonderful. And then, like some other fantasy stories, the first person they meet on this journey is a kind stranger, a bit like Mr. Tumnus and Lucy in Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. It's this wonderful bear with a huge basket on his back, which is just brilliant. And then it just gets off into this amazing journey across this fantasy world, and the landscapes are just brilliant. There's one here with lots of trees and a really big, wide open space. Where is it? Yeah. For example, and it's just the world building is just immense. I just love it. It's probably for older readers. Not that there's anything in there that needs isn't appropriate, but just because it's quite dense in a way. But it's just one of those marvelous stories. Okay, with a really lovely ending. Global, brand new, from the same two people that did Illegal, which was another graphic novel a few years ago. Owen Colfer and Andrew Donkin. And Global is like Illegal, about something very serious issue, and it's about climate change. And there are two story arcs in Global. One follows a boy called Sammy, and he lives in the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean. And the other one follows Suki, who lives in northern Canada. And Sammy lives with his grandfather, who are fishermen, and storms and the incoming ocean are destroying their village. And there's less fish in the ocean than there was before, so they're really struggling. And Yuki, sorry, that was her name, is trying to save some bears in Canada, and the polar bears and the grizzly bears are crossbreeding because their habitats are sort of becoming less distinct, which is a real problem. And she's trying to save them from getting shot by authorities. And then both stories link up on the final page, which is really nice. And but really they're linked all the way through because as the title suggests, it's global. It's a global issue that affects all of us. And yeah, it's really impactful. But there's some great design choices that I really wanted to pick out in the design of the panels. There's this one where Sammy and his grandfather are mending a net, and that's the way the panels are set out like a net. I think really caught my eye. And there's a few things like that which I think are really clever and just give the reader some clues as to how to feel about things and things. There's this one here where Yuki loses her glasses, so the panels are blurred, and I just think things like that are just such nice touches. That just add an extra dimension to things, which I think is lovely. Yeah.
Fantastic. And the two worlds are described, or the two places, I think, are just described in the narrative, which is incredibly economical, isn't it? The narrative, and it's just here and there. I think that's how they're constantly referred to through that.
Very clever, yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to talk a little bit about this book. I've got some internal spreads to show people as well. The Sad Ghost Club. There are 3, I think, so far in this series.
There is a 4th one coming out, I believe. But I really like these, and I'll tell you why. They are, even though it's called the Sad Ghost Club, it says on the back, this is not a sad story. It's not a sad story, and they're not. They're full of joy and full of hope, and the characters sort of struggle with worries and anxieties, and all the things that the children do. And what I love about them is that they're people who feel out of place, but they find people that they can relate to and they can talk to and support each other. And I think that's really important. And throughout the series, they meet more and more people dressed as ghosts, who form this friendship group, and it's like a support group in a way, and it's just how all friendships should be. It's just marvelous. And I see these as sort of self-help books in a way, and they're just so responsible as well. Like the characters say the right things to their friends, support them in the right way. They give them advice. They tell them to sort of talk to adults, trusted adults and parents. There's no shame in getting professional support and help. It's just all very, caring and responsible, and I think that's just amazing. I mean, it does touch on mental health issues, so with anything that's sort of like that, I think you need to read it first if you're going to put these into primary classrooms. Not that there's anything inappropriate in there, but you just don't know what some of your children are going through. So always read it first. But I just think they're wonderful. And in the back, there's a list of advice lines and websites for advice. And I think they're just as much for the adults as much as the children in the book as well, I think. So yeah, no, I really like them.
Brilliant. And you'll notice that I brought everybody back here, so we're all together again, because your last choice I thought was something we might all have a view on. I think there was a time when the majority of graphic novels we were seeing were adaptations rather than original stories. But we shouldn't forget that there are great adaptations as graphic novels. So tell us why you chose this one, Roy, and then I'll ask Rich and Ben whether they have any other recommendations for adapted books.
I mean, I bought this because I loved the original, and I was very intrigued by how this would live up to it, I suppose, or I was just intrigued, and it really does open up the story to a new audience, I think, who might be put off with an older text. But it's just, I mean, I was just saying to Nikki before that it seems like this is a classic in its own right. The artwork is beautiful. It's very faithful to the original. There's some wonderful page turns. The moment where he sees the garden for the first time, and you turn the page and see the garden. It's stunning. And there's another one where you turn the page and it's just the yard outside, and you feel his disappointment and confusion that there was a garden here last night, and it's very strange to him. And it's just it's really well done. The art is sort of in a sepia tone, so it's feels like aged, and it's just wonderful. There's my favourite moment in the book and in this graphic novel. It's even more my favourite now than that's in the graphic novel, is where he realises Hattie can see him, which is brilliant, and they poke their tongues at each other, which is just beautiful. And none of the meaning of the story is lost as well. At the end, you realise it's about memories and living in the past, and life moving forward, and it's just everything about the original, is in this graphic novel and more, I think. Yeah. It's
so
lovely.
the images that I've put on the site here are not next to each other in the book, but I thought it was interesting how many there are of Tom facing away and then you seeing Tom straight on, those kind of contrasts, and really lovely, like this very unsaturated colour that you're talking about there, almost like the colour's kind of been drawn out a little bit. And then these lovely lighting tones that give that sense of time passing. So as an adapted graphic novel, I really love it. Ben, are there any that you recommend that are adaptations of children's classics or Shakespeare? I mean, he's had enough graphic novels made of his text. Ben, you need to put your mic
I know
on.
there are a few in my class that are are popular. The often with the girls in my class, they've enjoyed Macbeth, Joe and Amy, which is a modern version of Little Women. I think some of the issues there are issues around modernizing, old narratives and things. Though that one has been particularly popular, and some of the girls who have read Little Women have made the connections, but also seen them as very different. I think what's interesting about Roy's choice is that it's a bit like when you sort of say, oh, they've made the film of the book. And Roy's one isn't an example of that. It's not a sort of lesser version that the children would then read and then think, oh, it's a good way for them to get to know Philippa Pierce's original. I feel with that one that it is very much its own thing as well, even though it's very true to the original book. I think that it holds its own, and I think sometimes adaptations can run that risk of either seeming like they're a simplified version or it's just pictures, for children who don't want to read the full novel or something like that. So mostly the books that I've got in my collection are not adaptations, but there are a few of those. I know the Babysitters Club has been done as graphic novels, and they are hugely popular with the children in my class. So there are a few like that, and if it brings them into reading, it doesn't matter. But I think that Tom's Midnight Garden one is a really good example.
Roy, is any of Philippa Pierce's text used, or is it all rewritten?
I don't know actually. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and check. But it's. I wouldn't be surprised if it is. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
We can
Why
all
do
go
you
and have
ask
a...
that, Nikki? Why do you
Sorry?
ask? Why do you ask about if it's?
Because obviously you couldn't use it all. And I'd just be interested to know if it... I need to go back and read it again, have a look at it. I'd be interested to know, because there are some such strong passages and lines of text that I could just imagine them being used alongside the images, in the same way that, it's not a graphic novel, but Leon Garfield's Stories from Shakespeare uses some of the Shakespeare text in with the narrative. So I just wondered, but we can all go away and we can all go away and research that one and have a look, unless Richard's got the answer.
I'd just been doing that research whilst we were on. So it's just freely adapted. So from what I remember, there are like small parts or passages, but it seems to be adapted.
I think it captures the atmosphere. It's the atmosphere, that book, which is such an integral part of it. This idea of sort of stillness in time and moving between time, and I think you do get that. And I love what Roy said about the sepia tones, because it is that sort of feel of you're looking at something older, and that's lovely.
Or a photograph that's been in the sunlight for too
Yeah.
long. That kind of feel. Rich,
Mm.
any adaptations, or do you steer clear of them? Are you a purist and you think, oh no, that's terrible?
I do like an original, but it's been something that we've looked at. We during lockdown set up a graphic novel group on Twitter with a range of librarians, practitioners, and it's sort of very welcome for everyone to join. But what was really interesting is when we did look at those adaptations, they were the ones which I suppose gained traction, gained sales, and then publishers cottoned on. So we found that, I mean, every text that's been selected today has got that sort of depth or sort of humour, or there's that resonance and connections. And I think it's quite tough to sort of be able to distinguish that necessarily when you go into a shop and see a wall full of graphic novels, if you're lucky, and to understand that with this, for example, the artwork and the sort of time and care that have gone into every panel, like that's clearly evident in this with Edith. And I was thinking of Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy, but then I was also thinking of what I've used in schools, and Pippa Ruffley, who I know you know as well, and I both planned a sequence around Macbeth. So Gareth Hines has brought out, it's probably upper key stage 2 at a push, more key stage 3, but we used extracts, and the work that we got from the children then after studying the Shakespeare, and it's got sort of full Shakespeare within the graphic novel, but there's such cleverness with the author and the content creator and the illustrators, because the children are able to track the dagger through a passage, and you can see Lady Macbeth with the dagger behind her back. You've got the dagger that Macbeth is imagining, and it's got this kind of ghostly hue around it. And I think that when you have not necessarily experienced, but the content creators who have spent that time to understand the form and understand the difference between panels and the gutter and all of those amazing things that I know are in these fantastic examples, I think that's when you can get a really good adaptation. So yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than just taking the story and putting it in visual form. But yeah, I can definitely only count on maybe one hand, possibly two at a push in terms of adaptations. I very much look for, I guess, yeah, originals or a different take, which I think Meg, Jo Beth, and Amy does bring. There's a lot of subtle and sensitive themes which have been drawn out from that.
Interesting. Just very briefly, these three, do we know these, and any thoughts about them?
Northern Lights I've used in school this year. It's been on the spot. I should have remembered that's just behind me. Yeah, and we always look at it not necessarily as a task for children to unpick. I think a lot of practitioners will just have, oh, if they like graphic novels, let's just redraw an extract in graphic novel form. And I'm sort of very against the sort of very stereotypical sheets of where you're given the children have the panels like there, and they're usually rectangular and they're usually in a sequence of 9. And if you look at good adaptations, good graphic novels, they don't have that. You'll have seen in Roy's example with Global, they play around with that. So I think if you get graphic novel readers, have that kind of not the confidence, but just have that kind of sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, the chance, I guess, give the children a chance to sort of show how they'd like to present it. But yeah, Northern Lights I thought brought a different aspect, but I think I'm such a fan of the original in terms of text. And as Ben mentioned, as soon as somebody does the imagining for me, sometimes it takes it away. I haven't read the other two, but I have the Graveyard book.
The Gaiman one, I think that one's very popular in school. I think with it you know, with the upper key stage 2 and again into key stage 3, I think it's been made. I mean, it is a dark book anyway, but I think it's been made particularly sort of dark and almost sort of, you know, type like Batman. You know, the difference between the sort of uh, the adventure styles of Batman and the darker, you know, murder of the parents at the beginning is quite graphic. Um, so it is popular. I think with all three of those, um, if the sort of long bits of the Hobbit were taken out of the novel, then I think I would prefer the novel. You know, that the novel would be perfect in that sort of way. But the Graveyard Book is a great one, and Pullman himself was very influenced by comic books when he was an early writer. Things like Spring Heel Jack is half comic book and half novel, as is Count Karlstein. So it's a natural thing for him. But just like Rich, I'll read the novel for that one. I'll stick with the novel.
It's almost like you said that at the right time, because it's why I put the Phoenix up here, because obviously David Fickling and Philip Pullman together, very influential in that kind of renaissance of graphic novels, comics graphic novels in the UK. And here's, you know, a graphic novel by Philip Pullman, The Adventures of John Blake. We haven't got time to go into all of these, but I did feel that in a webinar about choosing graphic novels for the classroom, we had to give some recognition to the Phoenix Presents and the David Fickling stable. And I would particularly like to mention Jamie Smart, who I think is something of a genius. Anyway, I love Max and Chaffee. You know, that's coming out now for the younger readers. And I love his anarchic humour, and the episodic nature of things like Lushkin, I think is really great for readers that want, you know, that structure, that format is really, it's not easy to do. And I think he's just very, very skilled at it. So we're going to talk to Rich now, and then I'm going to bring you all back in. I've got loads of questions for you, and I realise we're going to have to talk quite quickly, but we're going to give Rich his time. So we'll see the others in a moment, and here we are. I'm so glad that you could join us. It's evident from everything that you've said so far that this is a real passion of yours. And as I did with Ben and Roy, I think I'm just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind talking through A First Time for Everything and The Golden Hour. Tell us a bit about those, and then we'll come to the other two of your choices after that.
So these, I have all of these at home, but unfortunately don't have them with me in class. So A First Time for Everything has just been published, I believe, possibly even more recently than Global. It's by Dan Santat, and I think I'll give an idea in terms of key stage, but obviously with graphic novels, I think the important thing as a practitioner is to read them yourself, have a really good understanding, and with the first two in particular, knowing the children that you'd give it to and knowing the themes and issues that might come up. So I'd quite happily give it to someone in upper key stage 2, but it would be perfect for key stage 3, and I've put upwards. I read this as an adult and it just spoke to me. It's something that focuses primarily on Dan's life. Age 13, he goes on an exchange over to Europe. It deals with his childhood and early upbringing in family. But I think what's so strong and resonant in it is his portrayal of boyhood. And I think we've recently had the pleasure to speak to Dan with this graphic novel group, and there was a lot of talk about him finding comfort in the discomfort. So a lot of the trials and tribulations that he goes on, it's first time for everything. So he has his first Fanta. So each of, rather than split up with chapters, they're split up with Fanta flavors for each kind of section. And yeah, it just goes through a lot of those firsts and lots of sort of stumbling through teenagehood, really. And I think what I really loved about it was that it had, I suppose, Easter eggs in the sense that just like in films where you can spot connections and puzzles that are within the text, people who spend that time sort of not hiding them but putting them in, it's really lovely to be able to take the time and do a slow read to take that in. So I think a lot of the suggestions that I'll sort of showcase today are very nuanced. They've got that depth. Leading on from First Time for Everything is The Golden Hour. And this one, I think, is much more Key Stage 3 focused. It's got a range of different themes, and I think it will do it a disservice by just saying that there are LGBTQ plus themes around it. I think it's done really subtly and with lots of sensitivity. And so it's a book that has that thread through it rather than it being about it. So it's set in a rural American idyll and focuses on a boy who's gone through a lot of trauma. There's been this traumatic event which the readers aren't sort of shown early on, but have kind of, I suppose, memories or flashbacks throughout the story. And it showcases the young boy sort of coming to terms with both the event, but also with his friendships and feelings within, and passions that he develops through photography. So I'd love to showcase so many of the slides here because they use that idea of camera and seeing through the lens and setting up sort of scenes. So it's a fantastic read, but it has that depth because it really has a lot of empathy. I think all of these texts really resonate with all readers. They're not just for reluctant readers, they're for all readers because they've experienced those feelings and those emotions. The third one is Saving... Sorry?
No, I wanted to say something about that because it does graphic novels a disservice if we think that they are only for reluctant readers. In fact, there are some that, you know, if you are a struggling reader, this is not going to be an easy read for you necessarily.
No, and I think that idea of spotting that there's no like ceiling for access to these. You can obviously have language, which can sometimes be a barrier, but the great thing with graphic novels is you've got the image then to help with that lifting. And I think the best graphic novels sometimes have examples where the text is saying one thing and the image is saying another. Likewise, you can get them where they both say the same thing, and so there's so much nuance to them. I feel like the words that I use when I talk about graphic novels are nuance and depth, and I think that there's clearly sort of a lot of reason to use them in schools, but to also have them as reading for pleasure. So Saving Sawyer is a really lovely non-fiction graphic novel. I noticed you put up Corpse Talk earlier, which has sort of themes around non-fiction, but this is based on a true adventure. So it focuses on Trang Nguyen and Jeet Sedung, and it focuses on her upbringing, her life, and her passion around ecology. So there are clear environmental themes. But I think the lovely thing is it tracks this journey of her love and her development of this the bear, and how she looks after it and how she observes it. And I think you'll see in terms of graphic novels, there are lots of different call outs. There's obviously narration you can see on the illustrations here, and then kind of lovely sequencing, almost looking at Darwin here with the growing up. And I think when you get a partnership of author and illustrator, or you're lucky enough to be able to do both, you can see how that sort of on the page would appear not as engaging, but when it's translated into a graphic novel or put in this situation, it just can't help but put readers in. So yeah, I think this book really sort of made me think about observation, and obviously sort of clear links with caring for the environment and empathy. And I think realistically, probably year 4, year 5 up, in terms of both the content and sort of what you could use it for within schools or at home.
Oh, year 4 reading Gladiator's choice for next year, I think. Roy will be able to tell us, confirm that in a moment if that's the case. We've certainly been talking about it. But let's go on to your 4th choice.
Perfect. It was really hard to pick just 4, and I think I'm hoping I can smuggle in a 5th maybe with links to the Phoenix. So yeah, Lightfall is my 4th choice. It's by Tim Probert. Been lucky enough to speak with Tim recently, and it ties in with kind of the Studio Ghibli-esque sort of features around graphic novels. It's fantasy. It made me think when you were talking about great double acts, it doesn't necessarily fit into that same dynamic. I see both B and Cad, who are on the covers here, as kind of equals. But I think what struck me straight away, if you're a fan of books with maps in, this one opens with an amazing map of the sort of realm that they're working within. And I think what's so fascinating is empty panels or wordless panels or silent panels have lore like written into them, so you can see like these bones of a skeleton, and it's not mentioned, it's just for the reader to pore over. So Cad, which is the Galdurian on the right of that first book, it's a series of 2 at the moment, but I know 3 is on its way. Cad is kind of on the surface quite a whimsical and quite humorous character, but will come out with these amazing philosophical quotes or just thoughts, and it just leaves you as an adult reading it. You just kind of go along with the fun, and then it's this really sort of hard-hitting, sort of seminal sort of quote, and it just makes you stop and pause and think, okay. And I think the great thing with Lightfall is it deals with Bee's character is on the search for her grandfather and search for, goes on a quest, and she kind of deals with a lot of issues around mental health and anxiety. And I'm sure a lot of the people watching the video will know about Mel Tregoning's Small Things, which kind of bridges that picture book and graphic novel hybrid, I guess. And it's that way of portraying fears and emotions. But as you can see from the illustrations that Nikki's got here, they're just so fantastical. But you can
This
see
one took my breath away. I'm like,
it just you can't help but just pause. I think I'm such an advocate for spending the time and not necessarily picking pages to death, but just spending the time to sort of showcase to children that they're not just to kind of to flick through. They're great for that, But if you return to them and you reread, there's so much sort of almost hidden treasures in the very high quality ones. So I think it's really clear that Tim knows what he's doing with graphic novels, and it's just such a pleasure to read.
I'm really pleased that you mentioned not analysing to death. I think we've got to be very careful with picture books and graphic novels that we don't take an approach that we would reject with writing because it's just it's the grammar of how it works. But the book is so much more than the grammar of pictures. It's so much more than semiotic codes. And this is crucial, I think, because, we know that you don't teach a good literature, novel or a poem in that way, that you've got to go in at the level of meaning and depth and response and all of those things. And analysis might help us, but analysis isn't the point of it.
No. And I think it shows a lot of the same thing with poetry, like the openness, the personal aspect. And readers will read graphic novel text and take different approaches and different meanings from it. And I think that it's having that openness when we are using them within the classroom to have that, not have a set answer or a set idea in my head of what I think. And I'm constantly surprised. I sort of think of myself as very well read in terms of looking for all of the meaning possible. And then a child will just floor me. And thinking of Miles Morales' Shockwaves, and I was using an extract from that about to look at identity and cultural identity. And we're saying, like, what can we find out about Miles from his bedroom? And so there's a Puerto Rican flag on the wall. There's his computer's got little sort of text on that the children can unpick. And then a child was just like, oh, there's a Rubik's Cube on the floor and it's solved. And I just not picked up on that. And I was like, okay, well, what does that mean if it's solved? Like, knowing that they'd spotted something that I hadn't, and I knew what was behind that. But it's the kind of showcasing to the children that, like, well, tell me a bit more. Like, what does that tell us as a reader? Why do you think the creators put that in? And it's not looking to kind of answer sort of questions, but my goodness, the amount of inference and authorial choice, things which as teachers we have to sort of teach and have to look at in terms of skills for the children to learn. But like to use an extract or something like that, and I love those interactions in class.
I'm just going to share very quickly a couple of books that link in a little way to what you talked about. You mentioned the Dan Sandhat. I think it's quite interesting that this book came out almost at the same time, School Trip, the third in the Jerry Craft's New Kid trilogy. I'm not going to go into it in depth because, as I've said, there's an interview with Jerry and he talks about his own work. So he's much better talking about his own work than I am. But I do think that one of the reasons that some gatekeepers don't like graphic novels, because not everybody's as enthusiastic as we are. And I think it's because they find the reading of them quite difficult. They don't know how to read them. And what I really like about Jerry's work is that he has the reader in mind and guiding them through. So when you look at how, I'll just show you very briefly, when you look at how his dialogue is laid out, he's really supporting that reader through. And here, whereas here it can be free because those things could be said in any order. But when you look at this example here and that economical way in which that exchange has been shown, if you were to show that over several panels, it wouldn't be as powerful as the single image that he's got here with all of the dialogue in the center between them. And I really appreciate that from the point of view of what it's like for a reader who might not be familiar with this form to read.
I think it also allows them with something like that. It's like the structure of not necessarily getting them to go through in a set order, but once they've got an understanding of how the sort of boxes and call outs work like this, then you can look at something like Another Kind or another graphic novel where by having a dotted line around the call out, it would imply it's more of a thought, and then it gives that sort of I suppose there's so many features that you need to know, and I mean, you've recommended a bunch to me as an adult in terms of Scott McCloud and Neil Cohn, but I was thinking in terms of what's helped me recently is there's a person called Ursula Murray Husted who wrote Cat Story. You'll love it in terms of the art references, but she's created on her website like a guide, and I've sort of signposted my children who love to create their own graphic novels, many in the sort of style of Jamie Smart. And it's that idea of giving them the skills or the tools, the toolkit, and maybe sort of giving them little bit by little so they're not bombarded with, okay, if you're talking in a different language, you need to use brackets. But that's something that they'll get to if they sort of go through a range of different graphic novels. But I think you're right, there's definitely, it's quite a skill, I think, sometimes to read a page. And if you think of something like moving on to manga, which is obviously right to left instead of left to right, there's so much sort of difference, I think. And for us to teach readers to read to start with, and then we're presenting with something like this, there's definitely stages, I think, that you need to go through as a reader.
What's interesting is he's doing his own lettering here. The Marvel comics that we talked about earlier, that would have been somebody else. In fact, I know somebody who used to do that, was the lettering artist for Spider-Man. But he doesn't do his own colouring. So we've got a colourist in here, whereas a lot of them will do their own colouring as well. I'm going to bring everybody back just for our last few thoughts. One of the other books that I was going to talk about, but I'm only going to briefly flag it up because, again, Sylvie Kantorowicz is on the webinar that I made with Jerry. This is an autobiography, and it's an autobiography of an artist, and it's an autobiography of a French artist who now lives in Canada. And it's really interesting that she chose, again, because of comics being so much a part of her childhood and her background, it's not insignificant that she's French, because the French have long had graphic novels for all ages. You would not have felt that people were looking at you if you walked down the street with a graphic novel in Paris or in Angoulême, where the biggest, graphic novels festival is. And the reason that I've kind of flagged it up is because, and it's evident from all of the books that you've shared with us today, that the graphic novel is not a genre. It's a form. And there will be many different kinds of readers who read for different, this is a different reader to the Chaffee reader, potentially. I mean, they might like both, but potentially it's a very different reader. And so I wanted to ask Roy, from a librarian's point of view, how we make these available to children.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, in my libraries, I do group all the graphic novels together, but maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I feel like sometimes they get lost if in the fiction section if I was to separate them all up. But maybe there's room for discussion on that. I don't know. It would be nice to sort of put, the Tom's Midnight Garden, next to the original, for example, or to some more classic books, from that time period, maybe, or more time slip novels together at the same shelf. So yeah, it's one to think about, definitely.
I don't think it's either or particularly.
No.
I think it's doing it different ways, showing different possibilities, and perhaps bringing new readers in by just mixing it up and doing it differently sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm interested to know what you thought about each other's choices. Maybe I should just go on to my last choice. I haven't told you very much about Sylvie at all, but you can watch her talking about her own work if you want to. But my other choice was a fairly new book, Squished. And I just like this because it's like family. And, I was responding to this huge family and the girl, and now I've forgotten her name because I'm getting old and I've got terrible memory. But she wants her own space. She desperately wants her own room, and her older brother is given the spare room that there is in the house, and she has to spend a lot of her time looking after the younger children, and it carries with it both resentment but also love for the family. And I just really loved that representation of family, this blended, it's not really a blended family, but it's a mixed race family. Yeah, and there's some other graphic novels on the screen here that are also about the everyday and real, the emotional experiences that young people go through. Equally, I liked the artwork in this, and how it kind of shifts from the daydream into reality. You get both of those kinds of things going on there. So just to end, because we have had a good long chat, what did you think about what came up from other people's suggestions and, the comments that people have been making as we've been chatting?
I think what it shows, it's interesting because none of us, talked about our choices before necessarily, and when we were choosing them. And I think what's really interesting is that it really does show the depth and breadth of the form of a graphic novel, of the graphic novel. Like you say, Nikki, there's some there which are real life. I think that there's a sort of stigma attached in some ways that graphic novel equals comics equals Marvel equals fantasy, and actually that's obviously completely untrue. It's not one particular genre of writing. You get this whole range. And then the only other thing I would say is the frustration that I'm thinking, oh, there's so many other ones that we could have mentioned as well that are there. I mean, I was looking at Rich's Lightfall, and then thinking of the Amulet series, and it's just that is just hugely popular. And at the moment, the Lightfall and Amulet ones, they're wanting, when's the next one out? When's the next one? I mean, Amulet's just about to have number 9 published as well. So there's just such a range. There's such a huge amount out there, and I think Roy talking about getting them into in the libraries and things is there does need to be this sort of push of showing that they are great novels, not just comic books as such. I say not just, but I'm
Yes.
100% behind them. It's not.
Yeah.
I
And people
would
like
never call them just a comic book.
and people like Paul Gravett would really want us to stick with comics rather. It's almost like graphic novel is trying to make it respectable. There's nothing wrong with a comic,
No.
he would say. So I'm interested, though, from all of you who are enthusiasts and incredibly knowledgeable, how, from a teacher's point of view, rather than convincing the children, what about other teachers that really don't get it? What suggestions have you got for, helping them see the value?
God, I can definitely local independent bookshop. It's interesting that about where they're usually located. There's usually sort of a space just for graphic novels. But if you're lucky enough to be near London, go to Gosh. The whole place is graphic novels, so you can't find just a space. And so Gosh Comics, interestingly, Gosh Comics, not Gosh Graphic Novels, but they have a huge range, usually imported, like ones from America. I think there's definitely something to say about what you mentioned earlier about UK, like homegrown content creators. So like when you're looking at something like No Country, which was one of my other sort of possible choices, there's lots of links to sort of like UK politics. And I think when readers are growing up on and getting through a big series like Amulet, which I think is a very universal, there's lots of themes within that which are universal. It's really interesting to think about where to go first. The big series, I think I tried to sort of not steer clear of, but definitely go sort of around the edges. But I'd say for teachers to check out Gosh's list. They have an end of year list. Just imagine, I know I get loads of recommendations from you, Nikki, But just having a look through, I think you can usually tell when there's been not necessarily time, but the kind of effort put in into both the sort of the words and the images. And when there are panels which are just kind of a plain background, sometimes that can be for a really good reason, but it can sometimes mean that the publishers just try to get the text out really quickly. So I think it's really read a lot of them, get into those ones that we've recommended today. But yeah, have a look at those local independent bookshops, go to your librarians who will just be picking those texts up. And yeah, ask for recommendations. And on Twitter, we call it, I think Mary Roche calls it book rich, wallet poor. And I think that's constantly me. But Roy, did you want to mention anything?
Yeah, just to echo you, really, just explore, the choices that we've recommended today. Local libraries, public libraries as well. They've got loads of graphic novels now. My local libraries have got a really good selection, actually. So definitely try them as well if you haven't got many in school. So yeah, explore them.
Well, what can I say? Ben, Rich, Roy, it's been an education. I've loved your choices. I've loved what you've had to say about them. I wish we had another hour. Well, actually, we've gone on a bit longer than that, but I wish we had more time to extend the conversation. Thank you so much for helping me explore graphic novels for the classroom.